A record-breaking blizzard was tearing through Nebraska, trapping hundreds of truckers on icy highways with nowhere to go. Until a small-town church did the unthinkable. With no electricity, limited food, and a crumbling roof, Pastor Elijah opened the doors of his nearly forgotten sanctuary. What began as an act of faith turned into a national phenomenon. As truckers poured in, strangers became family. And what happened next transformed the quiet town of Willow Creek into a symbol of American unity. You won't believe how one simple act of kindness sparked a movement that made headlines across the country. This is their story. Hit like and comment where you're watching from. Your support brings more amazing stories. Now, let's begin. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing through the flatlands of Nebraska as if trying to rip the very soul from the earth. Sheets of ice rained sideways. Truckers on Highway 83 had already pulled over. Wipers frozen. Visibility gone. Radios crackling with warnings. By midnight, the storm had swallowed the highway whole. Inside his rig, Vince Morrison, a 52-year-old long-haul trucker with a veteran's heart and calloused hands, stared through the windshield, white-knuckled. His fuel was low. Heater struggling. He hadn't eaten since morning. He radioed in a faint voice. "This one's bad, boys. Real bad." Other truckers responded with silence, fear, and occasional static. For miles away, in the tiny town of Willow Creek, population barely 600, the old stone church stood like a stubborn guardian against the elements. Pastor Elijah Bennett, 67, stood by the stained-glass window, staring into the blizzard. He had just finished his evening prayer when the wind seemed to whisper something more urgent. He walked to the sanctuary door and pulled it open. Snow slapped his face. But what he saw next made him freeze in place. Through the darkness, glowing like ghosts in the night, a line of truck headlights appeared. Dozens of them. Silent. Unmoving. Stranded on the roadside like forgotten giants. Elijah didn't hesitate. He threw on his coat, rang the church bell until the rope burned his palms, and called out to his wife. "Martha, we are opening the church. Now." Back in the trucks, Vince blinked in disbelief as the ancient bell echoed through the snowstorm. Then lights flickered on inside the church. One by one, the trucks began to creep forward, following hope like moths to flame. Inside the church, Martha lit every candle she could find. Folding chairs came out. Blankets from closets. Old pots went onto the stove. They had no plan. No supplies for 50 strangers. But their hearts were open. Outside, the storm raged harder. But something had shifted. Willow Creek was no longer just a dot on the map. It was about to become a story no one would forget. The great wooden doors of the church creaked open as the first trucker stumbled inside. Boots soaked. Beards crusted with ice. Faces stunned by what they were witnessing. Warmth. Light. The smell of coffee brewing. Vince paused on the threshold, blinking hard, half expecting this to be a dream. But Pastor Elijah was already moving down the aisle, arms wide open. "Come in, sons. You're safe here. Every one of you." The sanctuary quickly filled. Steam rose from soaked jackets. Martha handed out hot cider in chipped mugs while the church pianist, an old woman named Ruth, played a hymn with trembling fingers. It wasn't just hospitality. It was healing. By 2 a.m., over 40 truckers had arrived. Men and women, young and old, black, white, Latino, strangers now sitting shoulder to shoulder on pews, sharing soup, stories, and silence. The church looked like something out of time. Flickering candlelight. Snow falling outside the stained glass windows. The hush of survival thick in the air. Vince sat near the back, staring at a dusty cross on the wall. He hadn't prayed in years. But something about this place pulled the ice from his chest. Pastor Elijah stood before them, voice low but steady. "This building has stood for 138 winters. But I have never seen a night like this. I don't believe you came here by accident. I believe you were sent." A murmur swept through the room. One young driver wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Another whispered, "Feels like a sanctuary." Outside, the snow grew fierce. Wind slamming like fists against the walls. The town's only motel had filled hours ago. Power lines were snapping. Emergency lines were down. But inside that church, the air was sacred. Alive with unity, warmth, and something rare, the feeling of being seen. Then, just before dawn, there was a knock on the back door. Vince stood to answer it. Outside stood a teenager with frostbitten cheeks and shaking hands. "My mom's truck slid off the road. "She's trapped. Please help." Vince didn't wait. Neither did Elijah. Coats were pulled on. Lanterns lit. The sanctuary had just become base camp. Willow Creek had just found its purpose. The cold hit Vince like a hammer as he stepped out. His boots sank into knee-deep snow. Wind sliced across his face like knives. Pastor Elijah held up the lantern, its golden glow fighting the blizzard's fury. Behind them, 3 truckers followed, wrapped in scarves and grit. No one spoke. There was no time for words. The teenager led them a half-mile through whiteout. Trees bent sideways. A transformer exploded in a blue flash. But through the howl of storm and snow, they heard it. A horn. Faint. Rhythmic. A pickup truck lay half-buried in a snowbank near the edge of the forest. Inside, a woman sat hunched over the wheel. Lips blue. Barely conscious. Her young daughter, maybe 5, crying softly in the back seat, wrapped in her mother's coat. Vince lunged forward, wrenching open the frozen door. "She's alive," he shouted. Elijah took the child in his arms. Another trucker, Terrell, wrapped the woman like a soldier lifting a fallen comrade. They carried them back through the white void. When the church doors reopened and warmth poured out again, cheers erupted inside. The girl clung to Elijah like she'd known him forever. The rescue lit a spark no storm could put out. The next morning, the townspeople arrived. A mechanic with a gas heater. A baker with cornbread. A farmer with apples. Word had spread, even without phones. The church was open. The truckers were here. Help was needed. By noon, Willow Creek's population had nearly doubled. What began as shelter, was becoming something more. A movement. By the second night, the storm buried roads under 6 feet of snow. Power was gone. The water tower froze. But inside the church, it felt like revival. Crockpots lined tables. Children played with donated toys. Elderly residents were wheeled in by younger men with diesel-stained jackets. They weren't just truckers anymore. They were protectors. Providers. Brothers. One man strung emergency lights across windows to mimic stained glass. Another cooked eggs for 50 people before dawn. Pastor Elijah whispered, overwhelmed. This is what church was always meant to be. Outside, the world began to watch. A single blurry video, Vince carrying the rescued child, was posted online. By morning, it had 600,000 views. Then the snowmobiles came, carrying supplies. Signs. Messages from strangers. We stand with Willow Creek. Truckers are our heroes. Reporters trudged in. Cameras rolled. One anchor wept live on air. But the real transformation was quieter. It was in the laughter. The healing. The forgiveness written in candlelight. On the 3rd morning, the sun broke through. And so did America. Semis rolled in from across the country. Big rigs lined the street. Banners painted by hand. Storm angels. Willow Creek changed us. A woman stepped out of a truck, holding a folded flag. For the sanctuary that saved our own, she said. The media called it a miracle. A movement. A moment America desperately needed. 1 week later, Vince stood at the altar. Beside him, truckers from 14 states. He was handed the keys to a new home, a gift from the very men and women he'd once called strangers. You gave when you had nothing, they told him. Now let us give to you. The little girl he rescued ran to him, yelling, Uncle Vince. He knelt, held her close. His heart finally whole. Willow Creek never went back to what it was. Because once the world saw what happens when strangers become family, no one could unsee it. And for the rest of time, travelers would stop there. Not for the view, but for the story. The story of a town that opened its doors, and opened a nation's heart.